Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Lamont, and welcome to NYO Canada Online Workshops. Our YouTube live chat is open, and we will be fielding questions throughout the workshop, so please feel free to post any comments, questions, and of course, chat amongst each other. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Bryan Holt, cellist in the Canadian duo VC2, as well as TSO Principal Flute Kelly Zimba. Welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and special thanks to the National Youth Orchestra of Canada for putting this on. Just off the top, I'd love to also thank Long McQuaid for supporting digital teaching initiatives of the National Youth Orchestra of Canada through the distribution of microphones. In this webinar today, we're going to be speaking about our experiences teaching online and our advice for utilizing this technology in the various platforms and organizations that can be of use to you while navigating online teaching and learning. Myself, I began teaching online in 2012, around the time that the National Youth Orchestra of Canada began a program, sort of exchange with the National Youth Orchestra of India. I actually met a student there, a student who came over in 2012, Bianca, who was a cellist, and she was studying for an exam over there, but there were no cello teachers. So while I was on staff in 2012, we sort of had a few lessons, and then over the course of the next year, started this sort of long distance teaching relationship. And in 2013, when the National Youth Orchestra of Canada went there, got to teach her a bit more, and she worked on her exam and passed with flying colors. That sort of became the topic of my dissertation, which I completed back in 2018, which focused on the various ways that the cello can be taught by an internet connection. And since then, I've taught lessons in several different countries, including the USA, India, the UK, Iceland, and Mexico, to name a few.
Yeah, so for me, my online teaching and learning experiences really began in earnest in 2015 when I began as a member of the New World Symphony in Miami Beach, Florida. So New World has always been very much on the cutting edge of technology, and I was lucky to experience that both as a teacher and a student. So in terms of online teaching, the first things that I did were actually to make some educational videos on a platform that they have called Mosaic. So we would play, excerpts or, pieces or really whatever, and we would play them. We would sort of give a brief tutorial about how to approach them if you're a student, if you're taking an audition, something like that. And that was kind of my first introduction to it. We also had the opportunity to take online lessons using a platform called Internet2. It's basically a really advanced video streaming platform. And so we could actually request lessons with teachers all over the world. And it was very useful for us. So I took a couple of online lessons that way. I also had the experience of teaching a few master classes to classrooms across the United States via this platform.
Yeah. And so both of us have pretty recent experiences in online teaching and learning, but it's not really a new phenomenon. The first teleconference masterclass took place actually all the way back in the 1990s, involving Pinka Zuckerman and a school in Finland. Typically, the early sessions were a lot clunkier than they are today. We're lucky to have pretty amazing technology in the palm of our hands. It usually had to be involving an institution of higher learning and some sort of telecommunication company working in partnership. Currently, there are several institutions of higher learning, like the one that Kelly mentioned, New World, that have access to this Internet2 technology, which provides high bandwidth connection, which allows for a bit more of a real-time experience. I'm sure everyone's dealt with a lot of latency these days, where it's not quite in sync. Most of the internet that we use is built off of previously installed telephone lines, and that's why you see so much of this move towards fiber optic cable with Bell and stuff like that to get those faster speeds needed. Skype and YouTube came into existence in the early 2000s, and since then the business of online teaching both open source and for profit, has risen exponentially, especially in the last 3 months since we've been in this quarantine. It's possible to get into this forum without much in the way of gear, though inevitably this can affect the quality of your experience, both for the teacher and the student. I mean, sort of a typical sort of setup is that as a teacher, we have we're going to need so much gear to kind of get our point across. And I'm sure a lot of you have experienced, your student with a little sort of phone on the stand or something like that. Basically, that's what we're going to try and talk you through today, is kind of helping your students get set up, how to get yourself better set up for teaching, and how to sort of best optimize your online teaching. There are two main schools of thought in terms of how we teach online. There's synchronous teaching, which is our video conference teaching, and asynchronous, which is curated things like playlists, video exchange learning, and lesson libraries, things like that.
Yeah, so before we get into some solutions, we'll just talk about some of the common problems that if you're teaching, you've probably experienced one or possibly all of these. So the first one that I find that happens a lot is that the sound quality is kind of like you're underwater. So it's actually very difficult to assess the tone or the sound that a student is actually producing. And a lot of times that's coming from, lack of equipment on their end, or like a strange speaker that you're using on your end or something like that. Along with that, like a lot of times, I can't speak for every instrument, but with flute, if you have a sustained note, especially in the high register, it kind of just cuts out at a certain point. It's almost like the system can't handle it, and you can't actually hear that sustained note. So you kind of just have to trust that they're still playing. So that happens occasionally if you don't have a great mic. In addition to sound, there's some lighting issues that can come into play. So like if you're sitting in front of a window, a lot of times you're really dark and like I can't really see the hand position very well, or it's just, awkward to kind of see what the student is doing. So it's great to have, like, if you can, the best positioning, lighting, all of that as possible. Sometimes there's issues with setup in general, like if they don't have enough space. Like their head actually can be cut out of the frame, or you can't see, like, with flute, if you're not set up in landscape mode, like you can't really see the hand position or the fingers or anything like that. So that can create an issue. Sometimes it's hard to get a student to stop playing. So if you have something to say, they might not hear you because they're playing and you're not getting that. So it can be a little bit awkward, and you can talk over each other, things like that. And then depending on your internet connection, a lot of times things freeze and you end up just wasting a lot of time trying to figure out like what's going on tech-wise, like with internet lag and things like that. And then like the last thing really, and this is kind of more for the student, it can be really difficult to find a lesson time because, if their parents are working at home during the day now, they might need silence, or if they have brothers and sisters who are doing other things at night, like homework, whatever, it can be hard to schedule a time that is both good for you and good for the students.
Great. So what we've decided to do today is we're going to break this talk down into 3 sections. It's going to be preparation, presentation, and curation. In the preparation section, we're going to deal with what you need to obtain before teaching and how to make sure you have the best setup possible. Presentation will deal with the in-lesson considerations, including the use of applications, screen sharing, and multiple cameras. And lastly, in curation, we'll deal with aspects of online teaching that will need to be covered after lessons, some of the scheduling things, creating video resources, playlists, and responding to emails. Just before we get into it, again, these are just sort of our opinions from what we've felt has worked best. And from some of what we've learned over the past few years. There's sort of an attitude in online teaching that whatever works. If you're finding that you're able to do it with just a simple tablet setup, that may work for you. But if, we've been kind of stuck in this a little bit longer, and online teaching is becoming more of a thing. It's possible you may want to consider investing a little bit more time and effort into creating more of a business type model for yourself. Let's talk first about setting up the lesson space. The room, as you can see in both of our setups, is pretty simple and plain, something that's not going to distract your student. And this, if it's possible for your student to be in a similar space, somewhat unlikely, but it would be preferable. Most likely you want a quiet space, not a living room where dogs and cats and siblings can run through, or somewhere that's next to kitchen, because all of these video conference programs are kind of built for speech, and a lot of those ambient noises get picked up and really wreak havoc with what we're trying to do in the lesson. You want to have a good source of light. You want to avoid, as Kelly said, being in front or having a window behind you, because then we can't really see what you're doing. And this goes, of course, both for the teacher and the student. And in terms of the room's acoustics, this is something that's a little bit different than what we might be looking for in a hall. Is we want actually something that's quite dead, because that's going to help us get a much better signal. We don't want so much reverb because that'll kind of add to the echo, and it'll make the audio a little bit harder to capture. If you have carpets, things like that, it can be really helpful to help deaden the space. You really gonna have to just play around a little bit to find something that works for the lesson. The location of the room is also pretty important. You want to have a room that is close to your router or modem. Ideally, this will give you the best signal. And if you can, it's best to plug yourself into the modem for the fastest speed. You may need to get some sort of adapter in order to plug your Ethernet cable into your computer like I do. But again, that's going to give you the most direct connection. The amount of space you need is obviously completely dependent on your instrument. For myself, as a cellist, I have a space that's basically the size of an IKEA carpet, like standard IKEA carpet, which is about 94 inches by 66 inches. Sorry for the non-metric measurements. This allows me enough freedom to move around, move backwards, sideways, to give different angles of my teaching for the student. And you always want to be sure that you're near a power source when you're teaching online. Nothing's worse than having your device shut off in the middle of a lesson. And you definitely just don't want to do any kind of disappearing act on your student, especially if they're a young one. They might get scared. Once you have your space set up, you're going to need the necessary gear. The first point, it seems to be a little bit cut off, but I would recommend using a laptop or desktop computer rather than a tablet. The reason for this is that it's a much more customizable device. You can generally have a better display. I mean, most laptops have a bigger screen than your cell phones. And you can do that hardwired connection into the modem. The next thing is the connection. It's really important to have that strong connection. There's many ways of testing this. There's a website you can go to, I believe it is called speedtest.net, in case you're curious about how fast your internet is, if you need to upgrade it or anything. The types of Ethernet cables that you can use, you can just get a simple one, but there are actually faster Ethernet cables. I use a Cat 7, using a Cat 8. Which just means it just has to do with the speed at which it's traveling from the modem into your computer. Other things you can do to improve your connection is to just be sure that other people in your household are not streaming things at the same time, and closing any applications that don't pertain to your online teaching, on your device. You're going to want to use an external USB microphone. Hopefully by now you've all received your Samson Meteors from Long & McQuaid. These devices basically make all the difference in online lessons. There's not a great deal that can be captured with just the microphone from your computer, especially because we work in such a specialized field of music. Basically, you can just use a USB microphone, or you can get to fancier setups using an Ethereal box, plugging in other mics. I can talk about that a bit later. You're obviously going to need a platform. There's too many names: Zoom, Skype, FaceTime. We're going to talk a bit more about Zoom today. And if you do use Zoom, just be sure that you have the latest upgrade when you're using it. External web camera is optional but recommended. I mean, most devices made in the last 5 years have a web camera that's up to specifications with this kind of streaming. But if you want to go a little bit bigger, you can definitely spend a few $100s to kind of get into the future of webcam. I would recommend the Logitech Rio 4K web camera, which is a bit more future-proof, as one of my friends calls it. Sixth thing you'll need is obviously your instrument. Don't have to talk about that. Number 7, you want to be sure that you have all the music that you need for your lesson digitized if possible, just so that you're not searching around. I mean, that's a lot like regular teaching. One thing I find really helpful is having my PDFs in a program called Fourscore, where I'm able to mark them up and then just send the student a PDF after the lesson. Number 8 is storage. That's if you're going to be creating a lot of video resources, you're obviously going to need somewhere to store it: Dropbox, Google Drive, things like that. Number 9, some kind of note-making application that goes with the Fourscore idea. But if you want to take, sort of handwritten notes or type them up, I use OneNote just to write them by hand, but other people just write it in email during the lesson. And lastly, there's a number of optional items like music notation software, and you may need various stands, cameras, etc., to sort of support your setup. Once you have everything gathered, you just need to get it in the right place, basically.
Okay. Before we move on to the next section, Brian, we have one question that came in, and that is, are there adapters for connecting an Ethernet cable to an iPad or iPhone?
Not to my understanding. What I'm using to connect it to my USB-C on my laptop is a little Belkin adapter. I'm not 100% certain that they would go into the iPad, but I haven't tried yet. It's possible.
Great. So next we're going to talk a little bit about if your students, this is like the ideal setup. So if you have a serious student or if you're taking lessons very seriously, these would all be really good investments and ideas to really consider for your online lessons. Especially if you're teaching a lot of younger students or maybe beginners, intermediate students, or just people that, enjoy playing but aren't necessarily the most serious about it. It's likely that they might not have access to a good microphone, that they're, investing in like an amazing internet connection, something like that. There could be some more issues. So something that you can actually have them do is record themselves ahead of time for you to have as a reference. You can either listen to it before the lesson or you can listen to it during the lesson. So it kind of just takes that, the awkward microphone / internet connection difficulties out of the equation. I actually have one student doing this right now. She sends me a YouTube link every week, and it's actually really good because one, I get a much clearer picture of what she's sounding like, and in case there's a connection issue, I can always go back to that. But also, she's getting the chance to really record herself and get practice doing that and coming up with some complete takes. So she's actually getting kind of better in that process. And then if she applies for like, a summer festival or something down the line, like, she has complete takes of a lot of different things that, if the quality is good enough, she could even use. Into the framing and kind of how to explain this, especially to young students. It's pretty basic. You just want to make sure that you're being shot from the head on. So you don't want like a ton of ceiling space, or you don't want like just to be able to see your chin or something like that. And especially if the student's like on their phone, like they might not be able to see that. So you might have to guide them through that right in the very beginning. In terms of sound, it really is instrument specific. So, use what you know based on your instrument. I know for flute, sometimes the excess air that comes over the tone hole, if it's right up on the phone, you're gonna get, a pretty fuzzy sound. So you might want to back up, or if the student does have a microphone, you might want to place it a little bit above their head or further away in the room, just because you're going to get, a lot of fuzziness that might actually not be very accurate. So, and then if you have to demonstrate something, you might have to do some repositioning. You can use 2 cameras if you want, or it could be something so simple where you have your hand position and you just like put it up, to the camera to make sure the student gets it, or you can ask your student to do the same, so you can make sure that they're really getting it right. Or if they have to like move closer so you can see their embouchure or something like that, don't be afraid to just ask them to do that, because we're not in the situation where we can go up and make an adjustment or something. So you kind of have to improvise there. And then in terms of the actual picture quality, if you can enable HD mode on whatever device you're using, that will make a really big difference for both you and the student. If the student has that capability, that'll help you see them a lot better. And then just in terms of distraction and just like the cleanliness of the presentation, it's good that, if you have a room where, like, Bryan said, you don't have a lot of paintings on the walls or furniture or whatever, like a blank background is the best. And then if you can wear something kind of simple, like a solid color. I didn't do a very good job of this today because I'm wearing gray against kind of a gray wall. But if you wear like a contrasting shirt, like black, or if you have a black wall, maybe like a white shirt, something like that, where it's simple, you can see it really easily. That's really the best way to go. And then, sometimes it also just helps, if you give yourself a few minutes before the lesson starts, just to check your lighting, check that your connection is good, check that it's all just going to kind of work as best it can before you begin, so you're not wasting the first few minutes of the lesson trying to figure all that stuff out, because odds are maybe your student is going to be doing that. So minimizing time is definitely the best way to go.
Definitely. And just in terms of placement still happening? Okay. So in terms of placement with larger instruments as well, that's going to also change where you're placing your microphone. So we're going to talk a bit about using the USB microphone. So obviously Kelly mentioned this, but you're going to have to figure out the ideal distance for your microphone to the device. Typically, when I, as a cellist, want to set up, I need to be about 5 feet back of my device in order to capture the full image from basically the base of my tailpiece up until the top of the scroll. And so that's not really ideal necessarily for my mic. So sometimes I will place it a little bit closer to me. You may have to obtain an extension cord, a USB extension cord, to get your microphone where you need it to be, because nothing's really worse than having a misplaced mic, especially once you've gotten one that is actually going to be a lot more useful than the one built into your computer. Another important thing you're going to want to do once you install the USB mic is to be sure that you EQ it. A lot of programs like Zoom, you can basically just go into the audio settings and check the audio controls to be sure that you're not peaking. This is something that Kelly mentioned in terms of the flute range, is definitely you want to be sure that you're playing, when you're doing this sort of sound check, that you're playing the full range of your instrument to see what's registering and what's not. You definitely, when you're in the lessons, to kind of avoid feedback and things like that, if you can, I would highly suggest using a pair of earphones. Mostly for the teacher, because you'll get a slightly better audio picture than you would without them, because using sort of internal speakers and things like that, or even Bluetooth speakers, it creates a bit of a delay, and that can kind of go back into the call and create this echo. So if you use earphones, you get a better defined sound and a much clearer picture of what the student's doing. In terms of what earphones to use, I like to use over-ear headphones, like in a recording studio. And if it becomes kind of annoying, like you need to demonstrate something, you can always kind of, just like in a recording studio, just sort of take the one ear off to get a sense of your sound, and then go back to the student's sound, so you're not doing too much on and off with the headphones. Just a little bit about the Samson microphones that you hopefully received. These are cardioid microphones, which means that the sound is focused at the front, so you're not going to get too much of the room picture. So you really want to be sure that you don't place it too closely to your instrument. You may need the USB extension cord to get it in the place that you need, and you may have to just order that off of Amazon or something like that if it isn't too long of a wait at this point. In order to use these, it's pretty simple, and I know many people have probably done this already, but you just need to be sure you go into the audio settings and change the input device. The output device you would want to just leave as your built-in speaker or headphone jack. One thing to always check before is sometimes your device will forget that you installed this USB audio device, so always make sure that it's set to that. In Zoom specifically, there are other little audio things we can do to make it a little bit more conducive to online lessons. A couple little boxes that we want to uncheck. The first is just right here, is you want to turn off the automatically adjust microphone volume. That will, that gets rid of some of these clips basically, where if we reach, too high a note or something like that, it kind of just stops. Maybe it doesn't stop all of it, but it'll definitely improve it. And then in the advanced settings, these two little boxes here, suppress persistent background noise and suppress intermittent background noise. You may want to turn those off too, especially if you're in a quiet room. Again, you'll get a more sort of focused sound in your signal. Again, you can get really complicated in this sort of teaching. I tend to use a little bit more advanced setup with using two mics, one for speaking and one for my cello. And just a little bit about that is that I'm basically using this AT4040 for the room sound in my speaking, and then something closer, this DPA 4099C for my cello, all of which just connects with a USB Federal box to my computer. Just a couple other little things about Zoom. Just you can, with the screen sharing function, you can get a lot of things sort of at your disposal really quickly. Having things like Sibelius and iTunes open during a lesson to sort of use as a resource. All you need to do is make sure that you click the button to share audio when you're sharing the screen, and then your student can hear those things properly. Another really helpful function in Zoom is the record function. Again, you want to be sure that you have your students' permission to use this, but this can be really helpful in a lesson to create some resources for teaching and things like that. You can also use a second camera in Zoom. Just be sure that you are in gallery mode if you're recording. And you need to just turn off the audio on that other camera. And I like to use that basically if I'm trying to watch, something that's going on with my student's left hand, or I'm trying to demonstrate something with the left hand that's sort of behind the scenes from what they can see in this sort of front view. And then just be sure that you're well set up with PDFs and stuff like that for your teaching. All right, we're now going to go into the presentation section, just talking about a bit more about video conference lessons.
Great. So with online lessons, obviously they're very different from in-person lessons, but there's a lot of similarities and there's a lot of opportunities to be creative. So I think if you have an idea that you want to try, really just go for it in these kinds of things. So the first thing I like to do before I schedule an online lesson that maybe I wouldn't do as much beforehand especially if it's a new student or someone who doesn't come every week, is that you really have to know what they are playing and planning to bring before the lesson happens. And sometimes, I mean, this is pretty organic in in-person lessons, but the reason here is because you need to have the music in front of you when you're teaching. Otherwise, it's going to be really hard to, point them to a specific, section or measure or whatever. So I have one young student, and her dad takes pictures of what she's worked on and what she's going to play. And so I have that. And then whenever she's, playing in the lesson, I can point to a certain measure or a rhythm or whatever. And we can really work on that there. And of course, this goes for advanced students as well. If you have the repertoire, you can just pull it out right in front of you, or you can get it on MSLP or something. So, but you want to make sure that you have all of that there. In terms of feedback, it's really important that you have a wide vocabulary that you can use with your students, especially because demonstrating is a lot harder online, and you don't get to actually go and either fix a hand positioning or help them breathe, or actually go over and physically help them in some way. So if you can have kind of a list, it's a good exercise actually to just write down a lot of synonyms to certain words that you use, so you can just communicate very effectively and efficiently with them. That's actually what I've found to be really big in online lessons. I know personally for me, I've kind of been stretched out of the box because sound quality is so often hampered. I've been, gravitating, really focusing a lot on good rhythm, pitch, the real basics of that. You might have some things where it's hard to comment on. So if you can veer into, another domain or something that's also equally important, but maybe you don't focus on as much in your in-person lessons, this would actually be a good opportunity to expand your teaching. So then when we get back in person, you have actually more tools at your disposal. And then a couple technical things when you teach. When your student is playing, you want to try to move as little as possible, just because you don't want to distract them. You don't want them to think that a hand motion that you're using is telling them to stop or keep going or whatever. If you're drinking coffee, try not to do it while they're playing, or in a break if you're talking to them, that's okay. But any kind of visual cue or what they think might be a cue in an online lesson ends up looking a lot bigger than it would in normal life. I always drink tea during my lessons in person. And so I've had to be mindful of that for online lessons for sure. So sometimes we talked a little bit about how it can be awkward to have a student stop playing if you want to tell them something. So what you can actually do is you can have a gesture where you can actually say, hey, if I raise my hand like this, that means stop. Or if I, whatever, you can have something so they can really see oh, okay, this is legitimately a point where I can stop, versus try to talk over them, because a lot of times that honestly doesn't work. I haven't done this, but some teachers actually have a stop sign that they have. So it's very obvious, okay, really stop playing now. And then also if you're in a louder space, if you, live in a home, if you have roommates or, kids at home or siblings or whatever, it's helpful to mute your sound while the student's playing, so it doesn't have any kind of awkward feedback, or you can really make sure that they're not hearing any excess noise, and you'll be able to hear them too. Okay, so then the next thing, sometimes you can actually, so when it comes to video recording, you can utilize that if you want to, and you can use it in a variety of ways. So you can have the video kind of be a reference point where you listen with the student during a lesson, and you talk about feedback. You have the student try different things based on what you heard in the video, or the student can send you the video in advance. You can listen to it before the lesson, and then have some time during the lesson, almost like a talking lesson, where you hash it out and you kind of see, you know, what's working, what the student could improve on, things like that. So it really is up to you how you want to do that. But I personally have found that having students create videos has been really helpful, both for me and for the student. And then the last thing really is more of just, you know, along the lines of keeping your students engaged. And this, you know, I think people are kind of experiencing, or at least I am to some extent, experiencing like some online fatigue. Everything is online. You know, your students might be in school online right now. They're like watching TV, Netflix, whatever, like a lot of screen time. So it kind of helps to just kind of break the lesson up. So a lot of times in between each thing, like I'm writing notes and I send them in an email to them. But when I'm writing those notes, I try to engage the student in, you know, being like, okay, this is what we worked on. What's a good way to summarize this? And then we talk about it together before we move on to another thing. And then kind of at the, you know, in the beginning of the lesson and at the end, like, I just like to ask, I mean, not that we don't always do this, but like really ask like how the students are doing, because, you know, they're probably not getting a lot of social interaction. Like it's a weird time. Like, you know, as teachers, I think we can be somebody that can, you know, be a bright light for them in this time and keep them excited and engaged, and, you know, just make sure that they're really doing okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and kind of along those lines, in terms of someone brought up a question just now about, you know, like how should we approach the length of these lessons, you know, based on, oh, there it is, differently to in person. It really depends on the age of the student that you have. I do teach a lot of adults, and an hour, you know, a typical hour-long lesson is not typically an issue. What I've done with some of my younger students is we'll actually break the lesson kind of in half. And I have this one student right now who, you know, is working on about a level 5 or 6 piece for a school project, but then she needed something to kind of motivate her back into playing the cello. And so we're working together on creating this arrangement for her of the song The Hanging Tree from Hunger Games, where she's kind of learning a little bit how to use GarageBand and create loops with her cello. So there's all sorts of little things you can do within like a typical confines of a 1 hour lesson. If you feel the student is not motivated, you can maybe change the subject up and create something that's a little bit more engaging than maybe something that we might traditionally do. And now just getting into the last part of our talk about curation. This is probably one of the most important parts. It basically has to do mostly with our time management. A lot of us are feeling kind of this Zoom burnout and sort of computer and device burnout. So we want to try and minimize the effort that we're placing, you know, each week, finding, you know, resources for students. Personally, I like using things like YouTube playlists and even sending them specific links to albums on Apple Music as a sort of a means of giving some demonstration without having to create so many resources, because there's so many people who have already put in the time. What you basically have to do is help curate it for your students, because a lot of younger students or even adult students get extremely overwhelmed when they start looking for advice on something on the internet. You know, there's so many different people telling you how to hold a bow or something like that, and there's a lot of people right now who are just sort of engaging in their passion of wanting to play an instrument, and that they're finding themselves completely overwhelmed on YouTube. Typically, when your lesson is done, you also want to be sure, as Kelly said, to give your students very direct orders, not orders, but direct instructions about what to do for the next week. And it's important to maybe check in sometimes with your students during the week. You know, how is it going? Like, how is this exercise going? Maybe providing a small resource for them to practice along with. A lot of what I do teaches out of methods that are cello duos, so I'll send them a practice track or something like that that's maybe got a click, or I'll send them various tempos to kind of help them bring it up to the preferred tempo. And along that line, you know, with all that time, the time that we have is we can produce some of these resources ourselves. Again, that goes with some of the equipment that you may secure. Like personally, I'm still waiting on a web camera to create some more high definition videos of some of the studies that I teach. And this will help you save time if you have specific methods that you use. Having these videos that you can always sort of reference is that you'll spend the lesson sort of explaining it and working with the student, and then they have something to refer to basically after you're done. Another thing that you can point students to while they're learning online is a lot of lesson libraries that have been created. One that I would personally recommend is ArtistWorks, which is based out of California, and they have several different schools of instruments. For example, like they have multi-style cello with Mike Block, which doesn't just cover classical cello, it covers bluegrass and improvisation and all sorts of things. But it goes basically from complete basics up until like he has these advanced etudes. So for any student, it's cool to just kind of engage with this lesson library that's very well curated. And there are, you know, several sort of hubs of these resources. Kelly mentioned Mosaic before, which is the New World Symphony's sort of online platform. It has a lot of great examples of really well taught online lessons as well, if you're curious about how that form works, as well as a lot of different educational videos on excerpts and things like that, recordings of various talks. It's a really, really awesome sort of hub for you personally as orchestral musicians. Might not be something that your students, depending on their level, would use. But they, of course, there's something basically for everyone there. That kind of brings us to the end of our talk today. I've just left up a few resources there, including the Improviser's Guide to the Cello is just another kind of example of a lesson library. Yeah, and I think we're just going to open up the floor to some questions now. What are the best tips for aspects of focus? Oh, I think we kind of talked about this earlier, Kelly. You were mentioning things like rhythm and pitch. I mean, do you want to expand? Like basically you were talking about some more technical things to work within the lessons.
Yeah, like, you know, it really depends on the student and the level of your student, but some things you can do, like today I was teaching a lesson on a Bach flute sonata, and we were just spending some more time with like the harmonic analysis part of it, and just looking at the score and really delving into that. Not that we wouldn't do that in an in-person lesson, but with the absence of really being able to be hands-on, there's a bit more time to focus on those kinds of things. And then also, you know, with younger students, yesterday I had a lesson where we were really just like, you know, breaking down, you know, a rhythm that like encompassed 2 bars. And it was like, you know, I didn't really have the opportunity to work as closely with her on like sound and tone production and like really breathing, you know, to see very well. So it's like, okay, let's really spend some time and get this aspect right. Not that we wouldn't have in an in-person lesson, but maybe we wouldn't have focused on it like as exclusively in some senses. So you can kind of, you know, stuff that's more like cut and dry that you don't have to be there so much in person for. That's what you can, I think, really gear your teaching to some extent.
Yeah, and to go with that, like if you do have to talk about something that's maybe not so cut and dry, it's definitely you want to access that sort of vocabulary that you've come up with. Like definitely for me, teaching beginner students and working on the bow without being able to hold their arms and things like that, kind of having a lot of imagery and strong metaphor to go along with the demonstration that you're doing, it really goes a long way.
Yeah, it looks like we have another question. Should we approach the length of online lessons differently to in person? You know, this really depends on honestly what your student wants and also your comfort level and how you want to structure it. If you have a young student who's willing to do an hour lesson online, you know, go for it. But I would say in general, like the attention span online versus in person is probably less. So you could do a shorter lesson if you want, or you can spend some time also doing, just like some different activities to break it up a little bit more. Or if you have a student send a video, you could say, okay, I'm going to listen to your video and give comments for like write down feedback for half an hour. And then we're going to have a half an hour lesson where we talk about it. You might try some things, stuff like that. So you could approach it differently that way. But I've also had lessons where they've been the same length of time and it's been okay. Yeah.
All right. Well, I guess we'll just hold here just for a second in case anyone else has any other questions.
Okay, I think that brings us to an end here. I would like to thank you both, Bryan and Kelly, for joining us today. It was a really informative talk, and it's kind of refreshing to hear that there's some really positive sides to online teaching that we can take from all of this. So again, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Great.